Today we'll be talking about Chapter 20, Section 4. And the first part of your notes is here, 1A, if you'll notice, the Columbian Exchange and global trade. So as we talk about the colonization of the Americas, we're going to be talking about lots of new items introduced to the East and the West. So, for example, corn makes its way into Europe as a staple crop. Was not native to Europe, however. Potatoes become staple crops in Western Europe. Again, not native. So there are many goods that cross the ocean for the first time that are going to become, very, very important.
Within just 50 years of Columbus's and Cabot's voyages to the New World, all the major European powers had entered the race to establish profitable colonies in North and South America. Spain and Portugal would continue to plunder and colonize the lands they claimed in the South. To the north, the territory that would one day become the United States was still largely unknown, but that would soon change. The vast, unspoiled wilderness, the fertile soil and temperate climates would draw colonists from France, England, and the Netherlands seeking new lives, freedom, and wealth, at tremendous cost to the new land's native inhabitants. For many Europeans during the 1500s, the idea of freedom and a new way of life was becoming increasingly important. In France, the French wars of religion were dividing the population into a civil war as conflicts between the Catholics and Protestants began to break out across the countryside.
The king, of course, Henry IV, was adhered to the Catholic religion, and throughout the course of the 1500s, the Protestants in France had a harder and harder time getting by. They weren't getting the kinds of jobs that they would want to get. They weren't having the kinds of official positions. They were persecuted, and over time they began to.
And so this is all part of the Columbian Exchange. It's called the Columbian Exchange, of course, because after Christopher Columbus and returning expeditions, which led to the conquistadors and the colonies, it also established cross or transatlantic trade routes. And so, for example, a Portuguese ship might land in Brazil and pick up corn or potatoes and take those back to Western Europe. Western European farmers are going to plant corn and potatoes. Potatoes just happen to be one of the most durable crops in existence. And so it's very likely that you're going to see potato farms sprout up all over Western Europe where potatoes just did not exist prior to this. Also, new animals. Did you know that horses went extinct tens of thousands of years ago in the Western Hemisphere? There were no horses left in this part of the world until the Spanish arrived. And so when Cortez came riding on a horse, the Aztecs had never seen a horse before because they'd been extinct for thousands of years. And then finally, one of the most significant goods, well, not a good, but one of the most significant things brought over to the New World was disease. Smallpox, polio, malaria, all of these awful, deadly diseases that decimated native populations.
The land was worked by peasant farmers who were allowed to cultivate small plots for their own use in exchange for labor they owed to the landowner. Transportation became easier because the Europeans introduced wheeled vehicles and the large, strong animals needed to pull them. Donkeys became a common sight throughout the countryside. Europeans also introduced the plow. This made it easier to cultivate lands where they could grow wheat and other crops that they had brought with them to the Americas. As you can still see in remote mountain areas, horses were used to trample the wheat to separate the grain from its husk. Sugarcane, originally domesticated in India, was introduced to the Caribbean islands. Ruins of 16th century sugar plantations can still be seen in the Dominican Republic. Life also changed in Europe and other parts of the world because American plants such as potatoes, corn, and tomatoes were taken back across the oceans to Europe, Africa, and Asia. This spread of domesticated plants and animals on a worldwide basis is referred to as the Columbian Exchange. Unfortunately, diseases also spread because people were traveling back and forth across the oceans. Native American populations had no immunity to Eurasian and African diseases, and their numbers decreased dramatically. European plantation owners in low, hot, tropical regions needed laborers who were resistant to the newly introduced tropical diseases. Africa provided a source for this labor as large numbers of Africans were forcibly shipped to the Americas to spend their lives as slaves. Meanwhile, Spanish towns and cities in the Caribbean region had to be fortified against English, Dutch, and French pirates who wanted to share the wealth of the Americas. In the 17th century, the French, Dutch, and English established colonies in Caribbean areas that had not yet been settled by Spain or Portugal. Struggles for freedom from colonial rule began in the early 19th century. By the 1820s, most of Latin America was independent from Spain and Portugal. New nations were established, each to create its separate history. The English and Dutch colonies became independent in the 20th century, but the French colonies remain associated with France.
And of course, global trade. This changes economics in a big way. For one, so much wealth is coming from the Americas that it affects trade and business in Europe. In fact, it creates a whole new economic system called capitalism. So many more people can experience social mobility that real wealth, instead of being equated with holdings of land, is now equated with private property or generating profit. More people are going into business, and this leads to inflation, that is, rising prices in Europe. With the prosperity is coupled with rising prices. So, for example, so much gold is coming from the Americas. Just remember, room full of gold with the Inca. Tons, shiploads of gold is coming over to Europe. That it actually raises the inflation rate for gold. Meaning a boatload of gold, suddenly it's not worth as much anymore. Also, so many people want in on the game that a whole new system of colonization is developed. So you have some royal colonies where the king establishes the colony of New Jersey. You have Maryland, from Queen Mary of Scots, the famous Catholic King of England, or Queen of England. But then you have Jamestown. Jamestown is a joint stock company. It's an investment firm. The colonists at Jamestown were business people, part of this joint venture, paid for by investors, expected to receive a return on their profit. And many of these colonies helped to found America. Jamestown became the state of Virginia. And a lot of this revolves around a new economic theory, and that's mercantilism. Mercantilism is based on the idea that the wealthier a nation is, the more powerful it is. Even warfare comes down to resources, that the wealthier nation will win the war. Why? Because they can outspend the other. And so this theory of mercantilism is going to compel nations to make more money. Why? Because to be powerful is to be safe. So I have to make the most money to keep my people the safest. Well, how are you going to do that? Well, I have to endeavor to increase wealth for my country. A couple ways to do that. Number one, favorable balance of trade. That is, I've got to sell more goods than what I buy. I've got to make more money than what I spend. How am I going to do this? Well, number one, I need a ready and cheap source for raw materials. I'm going to need tons of cotton, of rice, of sugar, of coal, of iron. Where am I going to get all this stuff? Of timber. Let's get it from colonies. We can exploit those colonies. We can use all of that stuff, and we can take it home and exploit cheap labor to make goods. And we can sell those goods cheaper than anyone else, and we can make more money. And again, more money equates to power under the theory of mercantilism. And so this is an economic revolution, folks, and it changes European society. I mean, it spurs the growth of towns and cities, because guess what? With this huge influx of raw materials coming from the New World, you now have cheap products, and businesses can establish themselves to make these products. And guess what? People are going to flock to the towns and cities to take these jobs. Guess what, though? These jobs still pay lousy conditions. Why? Because they can. You know, there's no laws protecting workers. You're going to work for what I offer to pay you. You don't want the job? Stack of applications in the back. So I'm going to find my cheap source of labor. Where's my cheap source of labor? I'm going to locate in a city, because that's where the cheapest source of labor is. Why? Because labor, like everything else in a capitalist system, works on the laws of supply and demand. If there's a lot of you looking for a job, it works just like an auction. I'll take the lowest bidder. Oh, thanks, Aiden. You'll do it for $1? Yes, $1. Oh, Efren won't? Well, sorry, you're out of work. Aiden will, you're hired. Cool. Oh, Aiden's unhappy? Don't worry, Lucas is waiting on a job. $1. You're fired. You're hired. Boom. Lucas is sick of it? Not to worry. Abigail's waiting. Okay, great. Jonathan will do it for 50 cents. Again, lowest bidder. That's how labor works. Okay, so speaking of growth of cities, this is Venice in Italy. They're famous for their canals, and that so much of the traffic occurs on these canals, so you got boats instead of cars. Well, look at how daggone big it is. Even in the 1600s, these cities are rapidly growing. Why? Because if I have a factory, that's where I'm going to put it. Why? Because there's tons of people looking for work there. There's also a ready source of water, which gives me a reliable means of transportation. And so I wanted to show you, to provide some evidence of the Columbian Exchange. And so on this little GIF, as the years move forward, you can see the presence of these European countries in different parts of the world. So here's 1492. Boom, there's colonization. Boom, there's more, there's more, there's more, and more. And then what happened? 1914, World War I. Boom, decolonization, decolonization, decolonization. And that's significant to understand. World War I is going to be a game changer, but the trend of colonization to fuel the theme of mercantilism is going to be a worldwide, ongoing trend. And then something big happens in 1914, and you see it kind of shrink back. So we'll talk more about that later.